Hello, everybody. Several people have asked, why should you make attributes private? There are two really good reasons. One is controlling the access to the variables, and the other is encapsulation, but you might not know what those mean, so let's look at some examples. Here is a bank account object where the attribute's public. You can see here, balance. So the whole bank account object is just a wrapper for this one variable. And here in a main class, we are creating a bank account object called account. And here we're directly modifying the balance. Anybody, and when I say anybody, I mean any part of the code base can set this to be any value they want because the bank account object can't control what it gets set to. So an alternative to that would be making the attribute private and forcing other parts of the code base to modify this value by using methods like deposit and withdraw. And the advantage here is now the object can control the access to its own variable. We can't deposit negative amounts of money. We can't withdraw amounts that are larger than what the balance is. And this kind of control isn't possible if you just expose your variables. A different thing we could do is have a password field. So you could have a password attribute, which again, you probably wouldn't want to make public. And then whenever any method call happens, you can pass the password, and if the password doesn't match the password of the object, then we exit with some default or error value. So that's the first reason. If objects control access to their own variables, then they can decide what happens with their own data. And part of that is ensuring that the data is always valid. I think in the problem sets, I had an example of a circle object, and the setter method ensured that it was never possible to set a negative radius for a circle, because that wouldn't make any sense to have a circle object with a negative radius. So a related reason for making attributes private is called encapsulation. This isn't a definition of encapsulation, but encapsulation can involve hiding the internal workings of your object. And you do that because that lets you change how your object works internally without the rest of your code breaking. If you have ever had the experience where you write code and then you want to change something and then everything breaks as soon as you make one small change, we usually refer to code bases like that as being fragile. And using encapsulation and objects is a way to prevent your code from being fragile. The most recent example I have of this in my own programming was I went to the San Jose airport and I saw this cool art piece where there were a bunch of clocks that would resolve themselves into times like this. And so I ran home and I tried to program my own version of it. And when I was programming my own version of it, I thought, well, okay, if I'm going to have rotating hands, like an hour hand and a minute hand, I'll need a line class. And to draw a line, I will need a starting pair of coordinates and an ending pair of coordinates. And so this was the beginning of the class that I had made. Of course, I made my attributes private, but I'm trying to illustrate what would happen if you made them public. So now that I have a line class, I can make a minute hand and an hour hand that are both lines. And then inside draw, I can draw a line that goes from the minute hands starting coordinates to the minute hands ending coordinates and so on. But I decided that, it would be nice to have hands rotate themselves. So I would love to say minute hands.rotate yourself by this amount. And so then I started to try and think about, okay, so how am I going to implement that rotation? And I started making a whole bunch of moaning and groaning noises because it was hard for me to dredge up all that math from my sleepy morning memory. And then I remembered that processing has an object already called a PVector object. The way I'm using it here is slightly wrong, but the way a PVector works is you create a PVector and it represents the difference between some starting and ending coordinates. And it has a built-in rotate method. So as soon as I make my PVector object, I can just tell it to rotate and it will rotate itself. So I thought, okay, it would be really great if I could rewrite my line class so that instead of having starting and ending coordinates, I use PVectors. So I'll have one PVector that points at where I want my line to start, and then I'll have another PVector that represents the difference between the starting and the ending. And it's not important if you feel like weird about how do PVectors actually work. The point is, when I had coordinates here, I didn't want to implement a rotate method because I couldn't remember the math, or I didn't want to think about the math. And then I remembered a PVector object would do it for me. So if I could only replace all my variables with PVectors, then it would be very easy for me to implement rotate. Well, here's the problem. The problem is, back inside draw, if I had not used getter methods, if I just said min.x1, min.y1, hour.x1, hour.y1, if I just accessed the variables directly, as soon as I changed my internal variables, everything else in the program would break because they were all accessing those variables directly. Because I'm using getter methods, nothing broke. Everything still worked as soon as I removed my variables. And so that's the power of using methods instead of public attributes, is that you're free to change your objects however you want. Of course, you might be asking, well, hold on. If I have removed the x-coordinate, how can I still get the x-coordinate? And the answer is you just change the implementations of your getters. So before get x1 just returned the x1 coordinate. Now I calculate what the x1 coordinate would have been based on my vectors. So the x1 coordinate is just my starting location x. The x2 coordinate, which is like the ending x coordinate, is my starting x coordinate plus this like difference coordinate, which is like the difference between the start and the end. And again, it's not important that you understand kind of how the vectors work. What's important is I was able to change the internal representation without breaking everything else. And that's a thing that you want to do all the time when you're working on larger projects, is halfway through the project, you think, oh gosh, I really would like to re-implement one of my objects so that it works faster or so that it's easier to do something new that I didn't think about. And using encapsulation to hide the internal workings of your object is a great way to do that. I hope that this has been helpful. Good luck.